Hi all, in today's video we're going to look at the impacts of climate change. Now this is the second video in our series looking at global climate change, and there will be one more to follow this and we'll examine the management of climate change. Now in today's video the kind of main thing we're going to be thinking about are some of the different impacts that climate change can have, funny enough, and we're going to be looking at how the impact varies on different scales, be they local or global. Now, the visuals for this video aren't going to be particularly breathtaking, not that they are normally, but this is the kind of the general layout that we're going to be looking at. Root causes, so what is the actual part of climate change that we're talking about having an impact? What is that impact? What is the local effect? And then what is the global effect? And sometimes those effects are going to be shared. So if we look at the first one, global temperature rises in general, which will then result in the melting of ice sheets. Now, that's going to cause coastal flooding, saltwater infiltration of different aquifers, and the loss of land that is used for agriculture and for building. There's some impacts. What types of effects are those going to have? So, let's start with coastal flooding. Now, that is a pretty kind of a huge global / local effect, depending on how you want to look at it. The mass displacement of people who live in coastal areas. Now, if we look at the example I've got here on the slide, Bangladesh / Southeast Asia, you're looking at potentially displacing up to and over 760 million people. So those people are all going to have to go somewhere. And then your question is we've been looking at kind of topically in the news recently about crises to do with migration. If you add climate refugees, how are they going to have an impact in the areas that they're going to? So the impacts we're going to see both on the nations that lose huge chunks of their population and huge chunks of their nations, and the nations which wind up hosting these refugees are going to be extremely pronounced. If we see saltwater infiltrating into aquifers, we're going to see a loss of effective groundwater that can be used for agriculture and a whole host of other uses. So, to start us off, what are some of the things that are going to be affected? They're at the Mekong Delta. Now, that's where Vietnam grows 47% of their national cereal produce. Now, that's huge. If you have that area impacted, you're going to have massive problems. You're going to effectively result in a huge amount of starvation, more likely than not. Also, if we see, huge amounts of saltwater being infiltrated into these areas, or if we see huge amounts of fresh water going into oceanic systems, we'll see alterations to oceanic circulation. Now, that's going to be hugely important. If we look at the UK, the thermohaline convection has huge impact on keeping the United Kingdom's climate the kind of moderate state that it is at the moment. If we alter the balance of salt in the oceans, or the ratio of saltwater to freshwater in the oceans, we're going to see huge changes to that, and that could potentially change the UK's climate in a very, very dramatic manner. Now, loss of land in general, this is something that you would think is reasonably self-explanatory, and to be fair, it is in terms of what the impacts are, but some of the different ones that we see, right, so locally, in the United Kingdom, we're already in a position where in the southeast of England, East Anglia, London, where coastal defences are becoming cost prohibitive. They're so expensive that people are really trying to, justify whether or not it's worth another 10, however many millions of pounds on top of the current costs of these projects. Bangladesh as a nation looks like it might lose 25% of its total land area by the year 2100. The Ganges Delta supports 300 million people, and it's 125 to 143 million inhabitants who are all going to be looking at a loss of the area that they live in. This all links back to this idea of displacement of people and the impact that can have, which is huge. Now, another root cause, so an enhanced greenhouse effect making temperatures rise. Now, so temperatures predicted to rise, somewhere between 1.4 and 5.6 degrees, by the turn of the century. Most people reckon, around about 3 degrees is what we are reasonably looking at. And the increase is disproportionate. As you go away from the equator, the increase in temperature becomes a lot more pronounced, and you could be looking, 10 to 18 degrees average temperature change in the Arctic and the subarctic. Now that's going to lead back to our previous point. As you have that increase in temperature, you're particularly in those extreme northern and southern latitudes, you're going to see ice sheets melting, you're going to see sea level rise, and that's going to have all the impacts that we talked about a couple of minutes ago. Now again, linking into this idea of increasing temperatures, that puts more energy in the atmosphere, and that will see an increased volume of storms. Now, we're talking about more intense, just storms in general, but we're also talking about hurricanes and tornadoes. Where these storms are going to shift because the scenario, the setting that you need for these storms is going to become more prevalent in different areas around the world. So where you find storms, that will change. The monsoonal rainfall, something that's vitally important in a couple of areas in the world, its nature is going to change. And again, mid-latitudes, going back to the earlier point, we're going to see more stormy weather in these areas. Now, if we're talking about just more frequent and intense storms, hurricanes, etc., you're going to see them causing greater damage and greater loss of life. Particularly areas in the developed world like Haiti are seeing more frequent and more devastating hurricanes than they're used to, or than they used to experience. And this has a more pronounced impact on that nation. It can't develop as quickly. It can't provide for its citizens as much as it otherwise would be able to. If the storms move location, then you're going to find areas that aren't prepared, even in the developed world, that aren't prepared to deal with those types of storms, having to then deal with them. And they may not have the infrastructure to cope with that. The United Kingdom very much falls into this bracket. Now, if you get areas that get monsoonal rain, one, if they're not used to it, they're going to have to adapt to it. But two, if they are dependent on them and they stop receiving them, like India, you're going to go back to this idea of agricultural land is going to become less viable, and we are then going to have more human displacement and all of the different issues that presents. Now, next, what about just general changes to climate patterns? That's going to make diseases occur in areas that were not used to them. So, a few examples here, malaria, dengue fever, yellow fever, these are going to start occurring in areas that are becoming warmer. Now, these areas don't have some of the infrastructures in place to deal with these diseases that they would require. People in Spain aren't used to sleeping under bed nets. They don't have them as a matter of course, and they would then need to introduce them. That's a step that has to be taken. We could be potentially looking at a return of malaria to Western Europe, and it's not been present here since the mid-70s. And, we are potentially talking, in the UK as well. If we get areas where the Anopheles mosquito can thrive because the climatic conditions change, then we are going to see the need to introduce management strategies to these areas that have not been present in the past. Now, we also see, this is one I always forget to mention, if you get higher temperatures, food rots quicker. Now, one, that's a problem in the terms of we're going to lose access to some food potentially, but also bacteria is going to become much more of a problem. And as a kind of a local impact of this, or a global one actually, because it would affect everybody equally, food storage facilities are going to need to be improved in order to manage that impact. Now, and I apologise for the size of the text in this one. The PowerPoint's been kind of funny when I was trying to make it look somewhat appealing. But if we're looking at changes in climatic patterns, not only is temperature patterns going to change, but we're also going to see precipitation patterns change. Key point here that this is not uniform change. It's not like we're saying, right, okay, as you move further north of the equator, you're going to see more rainfall, or further south less rainfall. The changes will vary in different geographical areas depending on that area's particular context. So, one of the things we can predict with reasonable authority, areas that are currently wet and experience wet weather regularly are going to see more of it, and areas that are dry are going to get drier. Now, that's going to mean that places like Scotland, for instance, are going to have more rainfall, and that means you're going to have an enhanced risk of flooding in these areas. A whole host of areas, the Americas, Southern Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, Central Asia as well, are going to experience much more frequent droughts, and that's going to have a huge impact on food production, particularly grain production. Areas like, the prairies, and there's others mentioned here, that are huge areas of global grain production, are going to suffer due to a lack of rainfall, and that could lead to serious global food shortages. If you've got areas where you've got, marginal agricultural capability, the Sahel in Africa, for instance, they're going to go from a position where they can kind of manage to use that area agriculturally in an effective manner to not being able to at all. And that goes back to the same issues we talked about earlier in terms of displacement of people. Australia, Central America, and Sub-Saharan Africa, right, huge drops in just precipitation in general. So that's going to have a huge impact on people, a lack of access to water for drinking, for crops, for use in sanitation, etc., which is going to have a huge, huge issue. We've got a couple of statistics here as well. We could be seeing up to 16% of the global population facing water shortages, and a 25% reduction in just the global economic output, not national, global economic output, due to a basic lack of resources. Now, the last one here, and again, apologies, I'm not really all that sure what happened to the format of these last two slides, but regardless, if we are looking at a change in available resources, then that means various habitats are going to come under stress. Now, a change in available resources is about all of the stuff we've been talking about so far. A change in the availability of water, a change in the availability of food, etc. all mean we are going to put various habitats under strain. So one, if because of these changes in resources, we are going to see people be displaced. We have talked about this already. We're talking about the generation of refugees on every imaginable scale. And the reality of refugees is that it is the people who are most vulnerable who are the ones that suffer the most. The people who are least capable of dealing with being brought into areas of huge change and huge uncertainty are the people who are affected most profoundly. And as it says, on the side, we are talking about building up to starvation and death, potentially on a very large scale. Now, the other side of it, when we talk about environmental change and habitats, obviously we could be talking on an environmental kind of slant. We're going to see ecosystems change fundamentally. As temperature and precipitation patterns change, it is going to change how the environment operates. So we're going to see animals migrate to areas which suit their particular skill sets, their particular adaptations to their environment. And that might include animals moving, south in the northern hemisphere or north in the southern hemisphere to find areas where they've got the right habitat to live. Pardon me. In colder areas particularly, this is going to be felt really acutely. It's a story that gets brought out all the time of polar bears losing the ranges because of the lack in sea ice that we see in the North Pole. But it is a real issue, and it does mean that the habitat that they need to thrive is being reduced. If you've got plants that thrive in high carbon dioxide environments, they would increase in abundance. And the overall impact of all of these different things is that we will see a global reduction in biodiversity. Now, I've kind of went through this really, really quickly, guys. So obviously pause the video, go back over bits, and we will discuss this in class as well. This, as with the first video, is not an exhaustive list of the impacts that climate change can have. This is something that you can use to form the basis of notes that I expect that you'll build upon. The next video, we're going to be looking at the management of climate change, and until then, I will see you guys later.